The opening ceremony right now in the main conference room. More people are coming now, and it's gonna start in like 8 minutes, so very exciting.
Congratulations, and thank you again. Now, as the UK's presidency comes to an end, I want to reflect on what we achieved together in Glasgow, and also what has happened since in our presidency year. Last November, the world gathered at COP26 against a fractured and fractious geopolitics as a once-in-a-century pandemic dragged mercilessly on. And yet, leaders recognized that despite their differences, often profound, cooperation on climate and nature is in our collective self-interest. And thanks to that spirit of cooperation and compromise, we forged together the Glasgow Climate Pact. Collectively, we achieved something historic and something hopeful. With your help, we closed the Paris Rulebook. We made unprecedented progress on coal and on fossil fuel subsidies. We committed to rapidly scale up finance and to double acquisition finance by 2025. We reiterated the urgency of action and support for loss and damage and established serious work on funding arrangements. And we hope that that has paved the way for a formal agenda item and tangible progress here in Egypt. And every party, and I repeat this, every party agreed to revisit and strengthen their 2030 emission reduction targets to align with Paris. So I want to thank the 29 countries which have already updated their NDCs since Glasgow. From Australia to Micronesia, India to Vanuatu, Norway to Gabon. And we also made progress outside the negotiating rooms with commitments from business, from finance, from philanthropy. Friends, thanks to the work that we did together, we achieved our objective, the goal at the heart of the Paris Agreement. We kept 1.5 degrees alive. Now, none of us could have anticipated the year that followed. We have been buffeted by global headwinds that have tested our ability to make progress. Putin's brutal and illegal war in Ukraine has precipitated multiple global crises: energy and food insecurity, inflationary pressures, and spiraling debt. And these crises have compounded existing climate vulnerabilities and the scarring effects of the pandemic. And yet, despite this context, there has been some progress in implementing the commitments that we delivered in Glasgow. Over 90% of the global economy is now covered by a net zero target, up from less than 30% when the UK took on the COP26 role. The biggest companies and the financial institutions of the world have committed to net zero. They've done so in force, with a global wall of capital creating green jobs and directing billions into the green industries of both today and tomorrow. Countries and companies are making tangible sectoral progress, from zero-emission vehicles to our breakthrough agenda, and are accelerating the rollout of renewable energy across the world. And the Secretary-General has been clear. Our shared long-term futures do not lie in fossil fuels. And I agree with him wholeheartedly. Every major report published this year underscores the point that progress is being made. And thanks to the commitments that we garnered ahead of and at COP26, and indeed in our presidency year, emissions in 2030 are expected to be around 6 gigatons lower. That is the equivalent of 12% of today's global annual emissions. And with full implementation of all the commitments in place today, including NDCs and net zero targets, the report suggests that we're heading to 1.7 degrees warming by the end of the century. Not 1.5, but still, progress. So to those who remain skeptical about the multilateral process, and of the COP process in particular, my message is clear. As unwieldy and sometimes as frustrating as these processes can be, the system is delivering. And there are many people to thank for that, and certainly too many to name. The Prime Ministers and the Presidents who have sensed the changing wind and indeed sought instead to harness it. The ministers to the miners who recognise a just and sustainable future can only be delivered with a clean energy transition. The civil society organisations, youth representatives and indigenous peoples who pushed us to consider and reconsider what was possible in Glasgow have continued to do so since. And of course, the brilliant officials, the brilliant civil servants around the world, not least in the UK's COP unit, who have helped to deliver progress. And yet, despite this progress, I fully recognise the scale of the challenge still in front of us. Just as every report shows that we are making some progress, they're equally clear that there is so much more to be done in this critical decade. Friends, we are not currently on a pathway that keeps 1.5 in reach. And whilst I do understand that leaders around the world have faced competing priorities this year, we must be clear. As challenging as our current moment is, inaction is myopic and can only defer climate catastrophe. We must find the ability to focus on more than one thing at once. How many more wake-up calls does do world leaders actually need? A third of Pakistan underwater, the worst flooding in Nigeria in a decade. This year, the worst drought in 500 years in Europe, in 1,000 years in the US, and the worst on record in China. The cascading risks are also clear. Entire economic sectors becoming unsustainable and uninsurable, entire regions becoming unlivable, and the strain on the global movement of goods and the pressure of people to relocate because of the climate crisis becoming almost unimaginable. So this conference must be about concrete action. And I hope that when the world leaders join us today, they will explain clearly what their countries have achieved during the last year and how they will go further. It is very simply a matter of trust. Without its constituent members delivering on their commitments and agreeing to go further, the entire system falters. I will do everything in my power to support our Egyptian friends, and the UK is here to reach ambitious outcomes across the agenda, including on mitigation, on adaptation, and loss and damage. And we know that we have reached a point where finance makes or breaks the programme of work that we have ahead of us. So whilst I would point to some of the progress shown on the $100 million, I hear the criticisms, and I agree that more must be done by governments and by the multilateral development banks, including on doubling adaptation finance by 2025 and establishing a post-2025 goal. Ultimately, though, I remain hopeful. Look back to where we were before Glasgow. Look back to where we were before Paris. Indeed, as we mark the 30th anniversary, look back to where we were before Rio. With thanks to all of you, the UK's presidency ends as a demonstration that progress is possible, it is happening, and it is continuing. Yes, we need to accelerate that progress in the remainder of the decisive decade, but I believe fundamentally that we can. We know what we need to do to keep 1.5 degrees alive. We know how to do it. And Sameh, you and your team have our full support. So now, friends, let's make sure we deliver. Let's make it happen. Thank you. So, distinguished delegates, I would like to invite you to turn to sub-item 2A of the provisional agenda for the session, titled Election of the President of the Conference of the Parties at its 27th session. You may recall that in accordance with Rule 22, paragraph 1 of the draft Rules of Procedure being applied, the office of the President of the Conference of Parties is subject to rotation amongst the 5 regional groups. We now continue the cycle with a president from the African states. So it gives me great pleasure to propose that the conference elect, by acclamation, His Excellency, Mr. Sameh Shukri, who will serve as president of the conference at its 27th session. I therefore declare His Excellency, Mr. Sameh Shukri, elected President of the 27th session of the Conference of the Parties. I congratulate Mr. Shukri on this election and wish him and his team every success in guiding the work of the conference. I now invite Mr. Shukri to take his seat at the podium. Welcome, Mr. President.
السيدات والسادة زملاء الأعزاء، أهلا بكم في شرم الشيخ. أهلا ومرحبا بكم في الدورة 27 من مؤتمر أطراف اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة الإدارية لتغير المناخ. اسمحوا لي أن أستهل مهامي كرئيس المؤتمر أن أتقدم إليكم جميعا بالشكر والعرفان على الثقة التي منحتموها لبلدي مصر، والتي عكسها اختياركم لها لاستضافة هذا الحدث الدولي الأهم والأكبر على الإطلاق، وانتخابكم لي لتولي هذه المسؤولية الجسيمة التي أطلع بها وكل ثقة في أن مصر ستجد منكم كل الدعم والتأييد لنمضي معا نحو تحقيق ما نصبو إليه. وأؤكد لكم هنا أن مصر لن تدخر جهدا في هذا السبيل، وأننا سنعمل على توفير أفضل الظروف التي تتيح لكافة المشاركين من كافة الأطراف الحكومية وغير الحكومية المساهمة في إنجاح هذا الحدث المهم وضمان خروجه بالنتائج التي نتطلع جميعا إليها. واسمحوا لي أيضا أن أنتهز هذه المناسبة لأتقدم بعميق الشكر لحكومة المملكة المتحدة الرئاسة السابقة لمؤتمر الأطراف على كل ما قدمته خلال فترة رئاستها وما بذلته من جهد لدعم وتعزيز عمل المناخ العالمي من خلال الأداء المتميز لفريق الرئاسة البريطاني الذي قاده صديقي الوزير الأوشار، الذي سعدت بأن عملنا سويا على مدار قرابة عام كامل لضمان انتقال سلس لرئاسة المؤتمر يبني على ما تحقق من زخم سياسي في غلاسكو العام الماضي، ويستكمل المسار نحو الأهداف توافقنا عليها ونتائج لا بد أن نصل إليها. سيدات والسادة، إن مؤتمرنا الذي يبدأ أعماله اليوم هو 27 في مسيرة بدأناها معا منذ نحو 30 عاما، وهي عمر اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة الإدارية لتغير المناخ. مسيرة متصلة أثبتت جدواها وأهميتها عاما بعد عام، استطعنا خلالها أن نصبح أكثر إدراكا للخطر الذي يهددنا وأكثر وعيا بما كشفه لنا العلم من حقيقة وتبعات هذا الخطر، وأكثر اقتناعا بما يتعين علينا القيام به من إجراءات لدرء والتغلب عليه اليوم قبل غد. إن مصر عازمة على مواصلة هذه المسيرة هنا في شرم الشيخ، لنجعل مؤتمرنا هذا نقطة فارقة وعلامة مميزة على طريق طويل لا يزال أمامنا الكثير من الجهد والعمل لضمان وصوله إلى وجهته النهائية، ولنجدد العهد ونرفع الطموح وننتقل بجدية نحو التنفيذ وتعزيز العمل الجماعي متعدد الأطراف من خلال التعامل الفعال مع أكبر تحدي يواجهه البشرية في الوقت الحالي. إن كافة الشواهد تؤكد لنا بغير شك ولا جدال إن تغير المناخ قد أصبح خطراً واقعاً يهدد حياة البشر في كل مكان وبكافة الأشكال. ويؤكد العلم بشكل قاطع إن نمط التنمية الذي سارت عليه البشرية منذ الثورة الصناعية وحتى وقت قريب لم يعد قابلاً للاستدامة، وإن الاستمرار على هذا النحو دون تغيير جذري سيؤدي إلى عواقب وخيمة تتحملها الأجيال القادمة فأكثر مما يتحملها جيلنا. ورغم كافة الأمنيات الطيبة ورغم كافة الجهود المبذولة، تؤكد الدراسات العلمية مرة أخرى من خلال أحدث التقارير الصادرة على مدار العام وفي مقدمتها تقرير اللجنة الحكومية المعنية بتغير المناخ إننا لا نزال نواجه فجوات تتسع بشكل مطلق، سواء فيما يخص الحفاظ على الهدف الحراري لاتفاق باريس أو التكيف مع الآثار السلبية لتغير المناخ، أو توفير التمويل اللازم لتمكين الدول النامية من القيام بدورها في هذا الجهد. ولعل ما شاهده على مدار العام من أحداث مؤلمة في باكستان وفي قارتنا الأفريقية وفي أنحاء متفرقة من أوروبا وأمريكا. لعل تلك الأحداث وما خلفته من دمار تمثل عبرة وعظة وصوت نذير يتردد في شتى أنحاء كوكبنا، يدعونا إلى اليقظة والحرص وإلى التحرك العاجل لاتخاذ كافة التدابير اللازمة وفاء بالتزاماتنا وتنفيذا لتعهداتنا. سيداتي والسادة، لا يخفى على أحد منا أن مؤتمرنا هذا العام ينعقد في خضم توترات سياسية تركت آثارها البالغة على دولنا جميعا، ترتب عليها أزمات في امدادات الطاقة والغذاء. وإذا ظن البعض أن هذه التحديات من شأنها تعطيل العمل الجماعي الدولي لمكافحة تغير المناخ، إنه من المحتم علينا جميعا هنا في شرم الشيخ أن نثبت عكس ذلك. لذا فإنني أدعوكم جميعا لأن نؤكد للعالم أننا ندرك حجم التحدي وأننا نمتلك الإرادة السياسية للتصدي له. ومن أجل ذلك فلقد كانت دعوتنا دائما أن الوقت قد حان للانتقال من المفاوضات والتعهدات إلى مرحلة يحظى فيها التنفيذ بالأولوية، ومفاد ذلك حتمية التعجيل بتنفيذ ما تراضينا عليه في الاتفاقية الإطارية لتغير المناخ، وعززناه في اتفاق باريس وبرنامج العمل الخاص به، مع ضرورة رفع مستوى الطموح لكل الدول وفقا لقدراتها المتباينة بطبيعتها. وهنا يهمني الإشادة بالدول التي قامت بالفعل بتحديث مساهمتها المحددة وطنيا ومن بينها مصر، وأثق أنني أتحدث نيابة عنكم جميعا حينما أدعو سائر الدول لأن تحذو نفس الحذر، لا سيما وأن التقييم الصادر مؤخرا حول مجمل وضع المساهمات المحددة وطنيا كشف أن مستوى الطموح الحالي لا يرقى للوصول إلى هدف باريس. وهنا أيضا تقدر الإشارة إلى أنه من أجل التنفيذ الفعال للتعهدات والوعود إن هذه المرحلة من مسيرة عملنا المشترك تقتضي مشاركة أوسع وأكثر فاعلية لكافة الأطراف المعنية من غير الدول، والتي أصبح دورها لا يقل أهمية عن دور الدول، وفي مقدمتها القطاع الخاص والبنوك والمؤسسات التمويل الدولية والمجتمع المدني ومجتمعات الشباب والسكان الأصليين وغيرها. تأكيدا لذلك فقد حرصت مصر خلال الإعداد لهذا المؤتمر على التشاور مع هذه الأطراف وإشراكهم في كافة الأنشطة والفعاليات، سواء فيما يتعلق بمبادرات دولة الرئاسة أو بالأيام الموضوعية المختلفة على مدار المؤتمر، بل وأيضا في قمة شرم الشيخ لتنفيذ تعهدات المناخ التي تبدأ أعمالها غدا على مستوى رؤساء الدول والحكومات. سيدات والسادة، إنني وإذ أبدأ اليوم مسؤوليتي كرئيس للمؤتمر لابد لي أن أدعوكم جميعا إلى وقفة للمصارحة حول حقيقتين لا مناص إلى إنكارهما، وهما: أولاً أن جهود تغير المناخ على مدى العقود الماضية اتسمت بقدر ملحوظ من الاستقطاب، ما أفضى إلى إبطاء وتيرة التقدم في عملية التفاوض. ثانياً أن الحالة الراهنة لوجود الحشد وتوفير التمويل المناخ تثير الكثير من الشواغل، إذا أن تعهد توفير 100 مليار دولار سنوياً لم يجد بعد سبيله إلى التنفيذ، كما أن أغلب ما يتوفر من تمويل يميل بطبيعته إلى خفض الانبعاثات على حساب وجود التكيف، فضلاً عن اعتماد أغلب التمويل المتاح على القروض. وأظن أنكم تتفقون معي أننا لا نملك طرف الاستمرار على هذا النحو، بل يتحتم علينا تغيير مقترباتنا من التعامل مع هذا التحدي الوجودي، ويتعين علينا السعي بجد وإخلاص للاستماع والتعرف على شواغل الأطراف الأخرى وتفهمها، والعمل على الوصول إلى حلول توفيقية مقبولة تكفل تحقيق التقدم وتؤكد بالدليل العملي ما دأبنا على المناداة به من ضرورة ألا نترك طرفا يتخلف عن الركب. رغم جملة التحديات التي نواجهها، إلا أن البشرية لا تزال أمامها الفرصة لتجاوز هذه المرحلة الصعبة، إذ ما توفرت الإرادة السياسية لذلك، وإذا ما استطعنا العمل سويا بشكل متسق ومتناغم. ونرى اليوم الكثير من الشواهد على ذلك. وعلى سبيل المثال، يشهد قطاع الطاقة المتجددة طفرة غير مسبوقة ساهمت في انخفاض أسعارها بشكل كبير، كما تطورت تكنولوجيا التكيف في مجالات إدارة الموارد المائية والقطاع الزراعي بشكل ملحوظ. وشهدت السنوات القليلة الماضية تزايداً ملموساً في وعي المجتمعات، لا سيما في أوساط الشباب، بخطورة تغير المناخ، مع عزم أكيد على التعامل مع القضية بشكل مبتكر وفعال. ونما بشكل ملموس اهتمام وإسهام المجتمع المدني ونشطائه والعاملين في مراكز الأبحاث، وتزايد دور المرأة وتصاعد دور المدن والحكومات المحلية وغيرها، مما يؤكد أن الفرصة لا تزال سانحة لوقف هذا الخطر الداهم الذي يهدد معاش وحياة الملايين في مختلف بقاع الأرض. سيداتي والسادة، غدا تبدأ قمة شرم الشيخ لتنفيذ تعهدات المناخ أعمالها، حيث يتوافد قادة العالم هنا للإعراب عن التزامهم الراسخ بجهود مواجهة تغير المناخ وأولوية العمل من أجل مستقبل نتمكن فيه من العيش دون خطر وجودي يهددنا. وعلى بعد خطوات من تجمع قادتنا، نبدأ نحن أسبوعين من المفاوضات والمشاورات الهامة والحيوية التي يجب أن نجتهد لتكون ميسرة ومنتجة. أدعوكم جميعا غدا إلى الاستماع جيدا لما سيعبر عنه قادتنا، وأطلب منكم الالتزام بتنفيذ توجيهاتهم وترجمة الالتزام السياسي الذي يتردد صداه غدا وبعد غد في كافة أورقة هذا المكان إلى توافقات وتفاهمات على النصوص والقرارات التي نعلم جميعا مدى أهمية التوصل إليها من خلال هذا المؤتمر. أناشدكم جميعا أن تضعوا نصب أعينكم إن ما نحن بصدده ليس عملا تفاوضيا منفصلا عن الواقع، وأننا نخسر جميعا إن ظننا إمكانية تحقيق فريق المكاسب على حساب فريق آخر. فمهمتنا جميعا أكثر نبلا من ذلك، تمتد آثارها لحياة ومعاش ومصالح الملايين من البشر حول العالم، ممن يعانون من واقع حي تتفاقم وتأطرف مع كل يوم نقصر فيه في عملنا أو نتباطأ. وليس هناك مجال لأن نهدر مستقبل الأجيال القادمة من أبنائنا وأحفادنا، فهي مسؤولية في أعناقنا. إنني لعلى ثقة كاملة أنكم تدركون حجم التحدي، وأن لديكم العزم والعزيمة على التعامل مع هذا التحدي بالكفاءة وبروح التفاهم اللازم. لقد حان الوقت للعمل والتنفيذ، فلننفذ معا من أجل البشرية ومن أجل كوكبنا. أشكركم وأتطلع للعمل معكم من أجل مؤتمر ناجح إن شاء الله. شكرا جزيلا. Delegates, honored guests, colleagues, this morning we are honored to have with us Mr. Hossein Lee, Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and Mr. Simon Steele, UNFCCC Executive Secretary. It is now my pleasure to invite Mr. Simon Steele, UNFCCC Executive Secretary, to address the plenary.
honorable guests, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you officially to COP27. Salam alaikum. I must thank my predecessor, Patricia Espinosa. We're all grateful for the valuable work you did over the last 6 years. Thank you to the outgoing COP President, Alok Sharma, and his able team for their leadership over the last 3 years. And I'd like to officially congratulate the Egyptian presidency and Minister Shukri for his election. Thank you for your tireless efforts as we work to make COP27 a success. Friends, today a new era begins, and we begin to do things differently. Paris gave us the agreement. Katowice and Glasgow gave us the plan. Sharm el-Sheikh shifts us to implementation. No one can be a mere passenger on this journey. This is a signal that times have changed. As Executive Secretary of the UN Climate Convention, it is an honor to be standing in a room of people dedicated to tackling humanity's greatest challenge. Every one of you brings a unique perspective. I come from Grenada, a state of 3 islands, Carriacou and Petit-Marie. Carriacou is my home, where my family live on a 13 square mile island with a population of just 7,000 people. Our history is of seafarers, fishers, boat builders, farmers, surviving on their wits and the strength of their communities, working closely together. My roots lie in a life full of beauty and adversity. As a teenager, I became involved in the global issues of the day, the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the anti-apartheid movement. I joined demonstrations and protests. I was often told one person cannot make a difference. Well, Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it is done. I hold that thought close to me. It always seems impossible until it is done. So this is why I say today, a new era begins, and we begin to do things differently. We will be holding people to account, be they presidents, prime ministers, or CEOs, an accountability chief if you may, because our policies, our businesses, our infrastructure, our actions, be they personal or public, must be aligned with the Paris Agreement and with the Convention. The heart of implementation is everybody, everywhere in the world, every single day, doing everything they possibly can to address the climate crisis. There are those that are going forward further and faster than everyone else. These are examples that must be followed. There are those who just need a nudge into taking further action, to go beyond business as usual. There are others who need support so they are able to do the things they need to do for their countries and communities, specifically highly vulnerable nations. And then there are those who still refuse to act unless others do. They will not be allowed to slow down the collective process. Let's not let positioning block progress. All of us have to do everything we are capable of doing. And we have that opportunity for the next 2 weeks. Our COP process is unique. We must create a safe political space, shielded from whatever else is going on out there, to do our jobs and deliver world change. The geopolitical situation, the pandemic, the food and energy crises have hit countries, economies, and most importantly, individuals hard. But let me make this point to humbly remind all of those engaged in this process of a simple fact. For decades, communities all over the world, very often the most vulnerable people, have been dealing with the continuous stream of crises, facing impact after impact of climate change. This has stripped generations of their lives and livelihoods. So here, in Sharm el-Sheikh, we have a duty to speed up our international efforts, to turn words into action, to catch up with their lived experience. This is a party-driven process. Over the course of my term, I will be mobilizing the process and Secretariat to boost party's drive. This is my promise to you. I want you to focus on 3 critical lines of action. This is what I want you to deliver on. First, we must demonstrate this transformational shift to implementation, putting negotiations into concrete actions. Every corner of human activity must align with our Paris commitment of pursuing efforts to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Let's be encouraged by the strides that certain sectors are making on this, and let's look closer at how the global financial architecture can be made fit for purpose in line with the Paris commitments. The second line of action, we must cement progress on these critical work streams: mitigation, adaptation, finance, and crucially, loss and damage. We need to enable enhanced finance to flow to addressing impacts. What is said in these negotiating rooms has to be reflected in the urgency of what is happening outside. There are areas of commonality which we can lean into and build bridges upon. We must build those bridges.
Colleagues, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change. Recognizing the continued importance of the IPCC within the climate process as we begin COP27, I would like to invite Mr. Hossein Lee, Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to address the plenary. You have the floor, Mr. Lee.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, as the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, I'm delighted and honored to address you at the opening of COP27. We are very grateful to the Egyptian government and the presidency of COP27 for hosting this crucial conference. We also want to extend our thanks to the people of Sharm el-Sheikh for their warmest welcome and generous hospitality. Thank you. The voice of today's scientists on climate change could not be sharper, stronger, and more sobering. We are not on track today to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The time for our collective action is now. IPCC reports presented to the world in February and April this year clearly show that we have the technology and the know-how to tackle climate change. But these options are limited by the availability of finance, among others. Adaptation options are further limited by global warming levels. With increasing warming, losses and damages will increase, and additional human and natural systems will push to adaptation limits. Therefore, the prerequisite to a successful adaptation is ambitious mitigation to keep global warming within limits, particularly 1.5 degrees Celsius, through to immediately cut in the emissions of greenhouse gases. Progress on the financial flows comparable to the goals of Paris Agreement remains low. Accelerated international financial cooperation is a critical enabler of low emission and just transition. Adaptation gaps, especially in the developing countries, are particularly driven by widening disparities between the cost of adaptation and financing available to adaptation. We can achieve the greatest gains in well-being by prioritizing finance to reduce climate risks for low-income and marginalized communities. Since the Paris Agreement, many countries have put in place climate laws, climate policies, and regulations. But their scope needs to be expanded, their ambition raised and implemented. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to save our planet and our livelihoods. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, this is an opportunity as well as an obligation. The range of options and most of all, the time available to them now will not be there for future leaders and policymakers. Before closing, allow me to reassure you that the scientific community remains ready to work with you and support you in every step in the way, every step of the way in this journey to limit global warming and also for achieving sustainable development. Humanity, our planet, and species living on it deserve nothing less. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the opening statements of COP27. Delegates, please remain in your seats. We will continue with the first plenary meeting of COP27, followed by the first plenary meeting of the CPM17 and the first plenary meeting of the CMA4. Distinguished delegates, and I invite the conference to consider sub-item 2B of the provisional agenda, adoption of the rules of procedure. The draft rules are contained in document F/CP/1996/2. Parties may recall that the draft rules of procedure are being applied with the exception of draft rule 42 on voting due to lack of consensus. This has been the case since the first session of the Conference of the Parties in 1995. At COP26, the President held consultations and reported that there continued to be no consensus on the matter and proposed that consultations continue at COP27. I therefore propose that we continue to apply the draft rules of procedure with the exception of draft rule 42. I would like to propose that the senior member of my delegation holds informal consultations on this issue. I give the floor to Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mr. President, and congratulations on being given the responsibility to be the president of COP27. It goes without saying that under your presidency, what we achieve in terms of outcome will have an impact not only on all people living in the world today, but also all the child who is going to be born from today onwards. Bangladesh is not opposing to the adoption of the draft rules, but being encouraged by what the Executive Secretary has said, that this is a COP from where we are going to do things differently. He talked about the importance of aligning our processes to the convention. He also talked about accountability being enforced. So the convention, as you rightly pointed out, Mr. President, actually states that we are supposed to adopt the rules in the very first session. And the fact that we have not been able to do so, even after 26 COPs and after 27 COP, does leave a question mark as to the commitment of all of the parties to ensure that we have a process to formalize the decisions that we take. Now, if we take out Rule 42, again I say we are not, Bangladesh is not objecting to it. The onus is going to lie on you, Mr. President, to make a call as to how we decide, how are the decisions going to be taken. And in this regard, I think the important point to make is that by consensus, we do not mean consent of all. So consensus is actually a general agreement, a broad agreement. So we hope that certainly as we go through the various challenges that we have and the various agenda items, consensus will not be used to mean it's a unanimity in all respect, because that, Mr. President, as has been the case in the past, leads to a situation where we are going to go on the lowest common denominator. That means whatever we agree is going to be so weak, so ineffective, that it is not going to be anywhere near to the challenges of today and what the UN Secretary General referred to as a global catastrophe. So we make this point and we would like this to be reported. We certainly think that this is an issue which needs to be addressed and resolved as soon as possible, but we are not objecting to the adoption of the agenda. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, distinguished representative of Bangladesh. Hearing no objection to the adoption of the rules of procedure as has been indicated, is so decided. Let us now consider sub-item 2C of the provisional agenda, adoption of the agenda. I invite parties to turn to document FCCC/2022/1/2, which contains the supplementary provisional agenda for the COP and the revised list of addenda to be considered under agenda item 8. I wish to thank all parties for their active and constructive engagement in the intensive consultations on the adoption of the agendas for COP27, CPM17, and CMA4. While parties expressed a range of views, there was a common desire to initiate proceedings swiftly and smoothly today, with the eyes of the world on Sharm el-Sheikh. This sends a positive signal to the world that parties remain committed to addressing the global challenge of climate change. Several parties expressed concern about the large number of agenda items proposed by parties on top of the workload in Sharm el-Sheikh. All of these issues are important, and my team and I took great care to ensure that all views were heard and accommodated to the extent possible. Further to the consultations undertaken, please allow me to outline the understandings reached regarding the adoption of the agendas of the COP and the CMA, as they are interrelated. I will also touch on the organization of work for some specific agenda items based on the consultations conducted and feedback received by the Presidency. In presenting the revised provisional agendas, I wish to provide several clarifications. On the proposal by the G77 and China to include an item on the agendas of the COP and the CMA entitled Matters Relating to Funding Arrangements for Addressing Loss and Damage, I propose that the agenda item title be revised as follows: Matters Relating to Funding Arrangements Responding to Loss and Damage Associated with the Adverse Effects of Climate Change, including a focus on addressing loss and damage, with the following text added as a footnote to the title of the item. Quote, this item and the outcomes thereof are without prejudice to the consideration of similar issues in the future. It is understood that, first, the outcomes of this agenda item are based on cooperation and facilitation and do not involve liability or compensation. Second, this agenda item includes the Glasgow Dialogue. And third, the agenda item will launch a process with a view to adopting a conclusive decision no later than 2024. On the proposal by Zambia on behalf of the African Group to include an item on the agenda for the CMA on the special needs and special circumstances of Africa, I propose to convene informal consultations on the special needs and special circumstances of Africa and to report under the agenda item entitled Other Matters. These informal consultations would include the proposal by the African Group and any other issues raised in the consultations. On the proposals by France on behalf of the European Union and Switzerland on behalf of the Environmental Integrity Group for an item on the CMA agenda on matters related to Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, I propose to convene informal consultations on the inclusion of the proposed agenda item matters related to Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement on the CMA agenda. On the proposal by Georgia for an item of the COP agenda on equitable geographical representation and constituted bodies under convention, I propose to convene informal consultations on equitable geographical representation in constituted bodies under the convention and to report under the agenda item entitled Other Matters. The informal consultations would include the proposal by Georgia, the assessment prepared by the Secretariat, and any other issues raised in the consultations. On the proposal by the United States of America for an item on the CMA agenda on the 7th review of the financial mechanism, I propose to convene informal consultations on the 7th review of the financial mechanism. On the proposal by Switzerland on behalf of the Environmental Integrity Group to include an item on the CMA agenda on limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, I propose to convene informal consultations on the inclusion of the proposed agenda item limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. On the proposal by Pakistan on behalf of the Group of 77 and China for an item on the COP CMA agendas on implementation of decisions 1/CP .26 para 11 and 1/CMA .3 paragraph 18 on adaptation finance, I propose to convene informal consultations on the inclusion of the proposed agenda item implementation of decisions 1/CP .26 para 11 and 1/CMA .3 para 18 on adaptation finance. Further, I propose that the following items be held in abeyance. COP Item 15, consideration of proposals from parties and amendments to the Convention under Article 15. Sub-Item A, proposal from the Russian Federation to amend Article 4, Paragraph 2F of the Convention. And Sub-Item B, proposal from Papua New Guinea and in Mexico to amend Articles 7 and 18 of the Convention. COP Item 16, second review of the adequacy of Article 4, Paragraph 2, A and B of the Convention. Dear delegates, with these understandings and with the immense gratitude for the flexibility shown by all parties to allow our important work to begin forthwith, I therefore propose that the supplementary provisional agenda is contained in document FCCC/2022/1/add.2 be adopted. If there are no requests, Excellencies, delegates, if there are no requests, no objections, it is so decided. Distinguished delegates, regarding the agenda item for which formal consultations by the presidency are required, I wish to inform that I will appoint senior members of my delegation to lead these informal consultations that I just outlined on my behalf, and I will keep parties informed on the progress of the consultations. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, allow me once again to express our appreciation to everyone who contributed to the smooth and rapid adoption of the agenda. Our success in launching our work without delay sends an important message of commitment to expeditiously commence our important and urgent work on all items of our agenda. I particularly welcome the agreement of the parties to include a new agenda item on funding arrangements to respond to loss and damage. This creates, for the first time, an institutionally stable space on the formal agenda of the COP, the Paris Agreement, to discuss the pressing issue of funding arrangements needed to deal with existing gaps in responding to loss and damage. All parties contributed to forging this consensus around the agenda through their flexible and constructive engagement over nearly 48 hours of continuous consultations led by the COP27 presidency, culminating a year of continuous work by the presidency. And at this juncture, it gives me pleasure to express our sincere appreciation to State Secretary Morgan of Germany and Minister Riojas of Chile for their tireless work in bringing parties together around this important issue. Inclusion of this agenda reflects a sense of solidarity and empathy with the suffering of the victims of climate-induced disasters. And to this end, we all owe a debt of gratitude to activists and civil society organizations who have persistently demanded a space to discuss funding for loss and damage, and thus provide the impetus needed to bring this matter forward. The conference is now invited to consider sub-item 2D of the agenda, election of officers other than the President. And Rasmussen, Vice President of the COP, begun consultations on behalf of the COP26 President on the election of officers to bodies under the Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. Groups have not yet completed their consultations, and nominations are still pending. I would like to thank Vice President Anne for the work so far, and I propose that she continues the consultations to finalize the nominations. I propose to postpone the election of the other members of the COP27 Bureau until nominations are finalized, and to return to this item at the closing plenary of the COP to conduct the elections. In accordance with the established practice that Confirmed nominees to the Bureau will be invited to attend meetings of the Bureau as observers during the conference until the elections have taken place. Parties will note that only 9 out of the 132 nominations expected have been received. Further, women currently comprise only 38% of the membership of the Convention, Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement bodies. I urge parties to nominate men and women equally so that we can achieve the goal of gender balance. I urge parties to intensify efforts to conclude the remaining nominations so that these can be transmitted by the deadline of 8 p.m. on Saturday, 12th of November. If I hear no objections, it is so decided. The conference is now invited to consider sub-item 2E of the agenda, admission of organizations as observers. The conference has before it document FCCC/CP/2022/7, which includes a list of IGOs and NGOs that have expressed the wish to participate in our work at COP27. This list was the basis on which organizations were informed of their pre-admitted status to COP27 on the understanding that final authority to grant admission lies with the COP. In accordance with the recommendations of the Bureau on this matter, I invite the conference to admit as observers the organizations listed in the document FCCC/CP/2022/7. Hearing no objection, it is so decided. Parties will recall that COP25 requested the SBI to review the approach to admitting observer organizations and to provide any relevant guidance to the Secretariat. The COP may wish to note that the SBI's 56 took note of the information provided by the Secretariat on the process of admission of observer organizations to the UNFCCC and provided no further guidance to the Secretariat. I now invite delegates to consider sub-item 2F of the agenda, organization of work, including the sessions of the subsidiary bodies. Today, the governing and subsidiary bodies will convene their opening plenaries and launch work under all agenda items. Upon completion of the opening plenaries of the SBSTA and SBI, the 5 bodies will reconvene in a joint plenary to hear statements from groups and observer organizations. Dear colleagues, let me outline how I would like to organize work in the COP. I propose that consideration of item 4, reporting from the review of parties, including in Annex 1, be deferred to COP28. On the following items, the COP will take appropriate action on the basis of recommendations from the subsidiary bodies. Item 5, reporting from parties not included in Annex 1 to the Convention. Item 6, report of the Adoption Committee for 2022. Item 7, Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage associated with climate change impacts. Sub-item A and B of item 9, development and transfer of technologies. Item 10, capacity building under the Convention. Item 11, matters related to the least developed countries. Item 12, report of the Forum on the impact of the implementation of response measures. Item 13, second periodic review of the long-term global goal under the Convention and of overall progress towards achieving it. Item 14, gender and climate change. Sub-item A and B of item 17, administrative, financial, and institutional matters. These items are already on the agendas of the respective subsidiary body. That body may develop draft decisions or conclusions for consideration by the COP as appropriate. In addition, I propose to refer the following matters to the relevant subsidiary bodies. climate change, I propose to refer the consideration of the annual report on gender composition and the synthesis report on progress in integrating a gender perspective in the constituent body process to the subsidiary body. On Saturday, 12th of November, the SPSTA and the SPI will conclude their work. I look forward to receiving the results under the leadership of Mr. Mapani of the subsidiary body, under the leadership of Ms. Carlson. Upon closure, I will convene a stocktake meeting to assess the status of negotiations and propose our way of working during the second week of the conference. Finally, please note that I plan to convene informal consultations at the level of heads of delegation on the overarching decisions of the conference for the COP, the CMP and the CMA. The consultations to be facilitated by senior representatives of the presidency will start in the first week and will be concluded in the second week of the session. I count on cooperation of all parties in the work on these decisions, which will be a notable part of
this COP session. Some processes will find themselves at a midway point. Others will be initiated, and there are some that will have to be revisited. Finally, our third line of action. We must enhance the delivery of the principles of transparency and accountability throughout the process. The environmental integrity and the reliability of the commitments made are paramount. I welcome detailed plans on how we deliver what we have promised across finance, adaptation, and mitigation. I found myself in my accountability chief role last week when we launched the NDC synthesis report, and I had to report that only 29 countries had come forward with tightened national plans since COP26. 29 is not 194. So here I am now, looking out at 165 countries that are due to be revisiting and strengthening their national pledges this year. I want to take a moment now to recognize the Glasgow Climate Pact. We made this agreement together only last year. I am not in the habit of rescinding on my word. I firmly expect all parties to act the same way. Stick to your commitments. Build on them here in Egypt. I will not be a custodian of backsliding. As the world pivots to implementation, women and girls have to be placed at the center of climate decision making and action. Their empowerment leads to better governance, better outcomes, and we need that. This formal process is led by party states, but it is permanently inspired, challenged, and pressed into action by civil society organizations who not only advocate, but act on the strength of their convictions. I intend to listen closely to their voices, particularly those of the youth, making sure they can be clearly heard and, importantly, felt. Our COP process has delivered a remarkable transition in the consciousness of humanity, in the timeline of human development. Our minds have moved from researching to understanding and then to agreeing on a plan. To paraphrase the wonderful Nobel Prize-winning Egyptian writer, Naguib Mahfouz, you can tell whether a person is clever by their answers. You can tell whether a person is wise by their questions. We have demonstrated the very best of human wisdom by asking the right questions. Now we know what must be done by everybody, everywhere, every single day, doing everything we possibly can. Colleagues, it's time to get to work. Shukran.